Well, friends, welcome back to the Space for Faith podcast. My name's Mike Goldsworthy, and I'm so glad that you are hanging out with us here. We have been spending the last, several weeks, a few months now, going through a book called The Divine Conspiracy that was such an important and meaningful book for a whole bunch of us, and we're just re-engaging it chapter by chapter. And I had invited friends along to help us process it and to just sort of like engage in like, what does this make us think about, and what did this do in us? And they have been so fun. I have really appreciated and enjoy getting to re-engage in this book, and I have appreciated and really enjoyed the conversations. They've gone in so many different directions and spaces that I was not expecting at times, and I'm so much richer for it. And what we're going to do today is largely two things. So we're wrapping this up today, which maybe is a little sad, and maybe is like we are finally getting through this book. And I know some of you have been reading along, and it probably feels like a lot. Some of you are just listening along, which is great as well. It probably also feels like a lot. So we're covering the last chapter of the book today. And I'm also going to kind of close it out and just offer some reflections on my experience as I kind of reflect back on spending the past 3 months revisiting this book, kind of what has that done in me, what has that raised in me, and maybe some of that will resonate with you as well. And then for this episode, we do not have a friend joining us today. And I'm not going to lie, it was difficult to get people on here to do this, partly because I was asking people to reread a part of a book to have this conversation. And as you heard from some folks when they read the chapter, like they were like, I did not realize what I was agreeing to, the 60 pages of this reading. And so I was calling in some goodwill favors with friends on this. But so it was a bit difficult. And rather than trying to chase some people down, originally I thought I would have somebody for this episode, and I tried a few different folks and wasn't able to work out. And then I thought, rather than keep trying, I'm just going to see if I can do this thing on my own. And so a couple of reminders about how we're approaching all of this, because I had to remind myself as I was prepping for our time here that I'm not trying to give a sermon here. I have paid attention to a few ideas that kind of stuck with me from the chapter, and some places where it took me that is maybe not necessarily where the chapter goes, but is things that it kind of did in me and stirred in me. But I'm not trying to provide some sort of comprehensive sermon on the topic. This is probably more for me than for you, but in this not being a dialogue with somebody else, there was a temptation that was there for me to move into that, and I had to keep remembering not to do that I actually just prepped this like I did every other conversation that we've had on here, where I read the chapter. I actually read it several more times than I did for the other interview, since I was going to carry the weight of this on my own. I read it several times, and then just kind of tried to pay attention to what are some of the things that this did in here. And I jotted down a few notes, but I did not create some sort of overly systematic thing that we're going to engage in here. And also, it's a good time to remind all of us that we're not doing something, and this is not what we did in any chapter here. We're not doing something where we're trying to cover everything that's in the chapter. We're not trying to dissect Willard, and we're not trying to dissect everything that was in there. This is more about what was something that stood out, was something that grabbed us, what got us thinking, what did we notice, and what did that do? And because I don't have a conversation partner with me this time, it's entirely about what I noticed. And so there'll probably be some things that got left out that wouldn't have had I had a conversation partner, but there'll also be some things that maybe I'll hit on a bit more that I wouldn't have if I had had a conversation partner. So all that setup maybe gives you a bit of an idea that this feels a little bit difficult for me to do, because I realized I really like having a conversation partner in these. I really like us both having engaged in the same thing, and then seeing where that takes us and being prepared to talk about some stuff, and then opening up new and different doors than what I intended. But this chapter in particular is also a bit difficult, because in this chapter, which Willard titles, it's chapter 10, by the way, and he titles it The Restoration of All Things. Willard gets a bit into heaven or the next life, the afterlife, and there's so much baggage that a lot of us are carrying into that conversation, that there are just so many things that I was like, gosh, what do we want to do with this? And it felt a little overwhelming, and I'll be honest, I put off recording this probably about a week longer than I had intended to because I don't think that I was ready. And I don't know that I am necessarily ready today, but one of the things that I always used to say when I was preaching weekly, and I say this when I teach preachers and when I teach undergrad preaching, is that like Sunday forces you to like have to have something to say. You can endlessly prepare, and most good preachers that I know never feel like done with their sermon. The reality is that like it's just Sunday shows up and they have to have something. And so that deadline forces something to come out. But if you didn't have that deadline, you would just endlessly like think about the thing and work on the thing and develop it. And I was realizing, oh, that's what's going to happen here. And I just need a deadline to force me, like Sunday would have something to preach, to force me to like engage in this. So that is what we're doing here. Chapter 10, the divine conspiracy, closes out the restoration of all things. And one of the things that Willard says is that what he's doing in this chapter, he writes at some point in the chapter that like he's providing a picture of a future hope so that we make choices that agree with its reality. And this is one of the images that I love that Willard has given me, not just from this chapter, but from this book as a whole, that there's this like picture of reality and it's already moving, it's already happening, it's already true, it's already real. And what I'm doing with myself and what the work of formation is I'm just simply like aligning myself with the way things actually are. It's like there's this stream that's moving, or like I think of our friend Aaron Nyquist, who was on, and he covered I think the third chapter with us, and the term that he uses that he wrote a book with the title of is that there's an eternal current. And it's already flowing, it's already moving. And what we're doing is we're aligning ourselves in that current. And so Willard is making the argument that having an appropriate picture of a future hope, it shows us where that current is moving so we can align ourselves with it. And this feels incredibly significant in the kind of space that a lot of us find ourselves in the kind of post-evangelical space, in the space where a lot of us have grown and evolved from the kind of faith that we had grown up with or inherited, and it has expanded and gotten larger, and a lot of us don't know what to do anymore with a future hope. In fact, the way that Willard opens up this chapter is that he writes that those who apprentice themselves to Jesus learn an undying life with a future as good and as large as God himself, or God's self. Those who apprentice themselves to Jesus learn an undying life. I don't know how that hits you if you read it or just even hearing it right now, but I kind of got a little stuck on that right there, on that undying life, because I think a lot of us are carrying some baggage with that kind of terminology that has been used. And one of the things that I have found is I have found myself in this post-evangelical space, getting to lead and pastor folks who are in the space and are leading in the space. I actually think we maybe seem to have missed engaging in a future hope. And there's probably like several good reasons for it. Like, as I've talked with some folks, like a part of it for some folks is because maybe it was like overly focused on, right? That you came out of traditions and experiences that everything was about talking about this like ethereal, abstract afterlife, and it would even get used in ways to like manipulate or control. And so you could talk about this thing that was intangible to get you to do tangible things. And this intangible thing, in some ways, for some, like was used for fear, that there was like fear of what could happen to you. And I mean, I'm with a lot of folks that have had to do a lot of work around their own sort of like experience of understanding hell, because hell was used in ways that was incredibly manipulative towards them. Fear was incredibly manipulative towards them. I can remember like growing up in the church that I would have these times, these memories from like high school where I would do things that were clearly against like the morality of the church system that I was a part of. And at the end of that day, that I would be like, I need to confess these things. And I would like pray and confess these things that I did. And the reason that I wanted to confess those things was not because it was like, oh, there's something in me that needs to be purged and made whole. There's something in me that's missing a fully and truly human life. The reason I needed to confess those things is because if I didn't, I had this fear that I was like damning myself to hell if if I fell asleep and I died in my sleep, and that there's this like thing that could happen to me. And so yeah, so we've got so much baggage, right? With like afterlife, in terms of way heaven was pictured, in terms of way hell was pictured, all that sort of stuff that comes with it. And what some of us have done is probably for good reason. Any kind of future hope gets largely untouched in a lot of the spaces that I'm in now. But the argument that Willard makes, that I think I would largely agree with, is that a picture of the future creates a vision and a direction for who we're becoming. I don't know if I would say like I would fall in that 100%, but like I think I can largely get there. And so to negate engaging in any kind of future hope and to make a faith experience that's entirely about an engagement in the here and now seems to me like it's like missing something. Like it's maybe a bit smaller and maybe a bit more shallow. And for a lot of us, our faith engagement really had nothing to do with the here and now. For a lot of us who grew up in the kinds of like faith systems that I grew up in, faith really had nothing to do with the here and now. It was all about this metaphysical reality that would happen to you after you died. And so it was about like making sure that that was all good and secure. And one of the reasons that the divine conspiracy was so significant for so many of us is that early chapter that we talked with Brian Zond about. I think it's chapter 2, where we get this. He talks about gospels of sin management. And many of us grew up in the systems that he describes as like the gospel was just about dealing with my sin so that I could get to heaven after I died. And it was this transactional sort of thing that was all about that sort of like an orientation that had to do with a metaphysical afterlife reality. And so my faith engagement had nothing to do with the here and now. What the divine conspiracy did for me and for so many others is that we got a picture of the kingdom as the primary thing that Jesus preached. And the kingdom is something that we can encounter and we can experience and we can live into now. And so that picture was deeply helpful. It was deeply helpful, and it helped us to reorient our faith system in a way that we began to see that what we were actually being called to in the Jesus life had radical implications in my life now and in my community now and what I was engaging in now. But in some ways, maybe what we have done is we've kept moving, and we kept moving to a place where there is no kind of future hope, or at least it's not talked about. That maybe there are things, this is one of the things that's so fascinating to me, that I have experienced in the post-evangelical space and in the progressive space, that when I was in more evangelical, more conservative circles, there were things that you just did not talk about, teach on, that it was like pastors would have these like backroom conversations, and then we would get up on stage and you didn't hit on those things. You didn't talk about those things because you knew that they could be so disruptive to your community. And in some ways, like that has to do with change theory, right? About like what will be helpful, what can help people engage so I can bring them to what I see as a more helpful place to bring them. But some of that was also out of a like, this will disrupt norms in this community. And so we only talk about these things when we are sitting in a small group behind closed doors, and we don't talk about those things in larger sort of settings. And my experience is that like I find some of that actually still happening in these other spaces where it's like there are things that we're talking about in smaller sort of settings, but we're really, really careful about the way that that makes itself out there. And I think it's because, well, I don't know all of why it is. But so rather than try to project onto folks who are preaching regularly and doing that good hard work, which I am only doing occasionally now, and so I don't want to assume any kind of motives there that may or may not be true. But I'll say this, that like there's baggage that we've got around a future kind of hope. And because of that baggage, we might miss tapping into, like, I wonder, a larger vision that shapes who we are now. Because it seems at some level, who we are now and who we're becoming now, and some kind of future vision, in some sort of way, they intersect and they interact with one another. And to remove one of those creates a kind of experience that's missing something. So to remove the who we are now and who we're becoming now is like it's missing something, right? And a lot of us figured that out. But to also miss some kind of a future vision, I think that that actually seems to be missing something as well. So there's a few pictures that Willard gives, and I'm not going to get into all the things that he gives, and some of it, like, I can find myself agreeing with, and some of it not. But I think that overarching idea feels really helpful to me. That, like, gosh, what is the future vision? What is that, and how is that shaping who we are and who we're becoming? And one of the things that he writes is, he says, there is no reason to think that the world of nature will cease to exist or to be destroyed. And I remember, like, years ago, I don't remember if Willard is honestly who first shaped me in this direction. I think actually the New Testament scholar N.T. Wright probably had the most shaping effect of this for me early on here. But began to recognize that the picture in the scriptures was very different when it painted a picture of a future world than what I had imagined and what had been sort of like the way that we had talked about it in the sort of like spaces that I was in, which was really like a picture that was passed on, but it wasn't really like the picture of future hope that was being described largely by the biblical authors. Like in Revelation 21, that it says that God will come down and dwell with God's people, that there's this picture of New Jerusalem descending down out of the sky and like coming to be with us in this place. There's this picture of this new heavens and new earth that seems to be here. And so one of the things that Willard would write later on in this chapter is he says, we can be sure that heaven, in the sense of our afterlife, is just our future in this universe. There's not another universe besides this one. I had always had an idea that, like, it's like, oh, the world is going to essentially like blow up and I'm going to live in some like ethereal kind of place, that's what heaven is. And I don't know that Willard is necessarily super clear about this. I think he is maybe a little bit more philosophical here, but where I would find myself now is that it's like, oh no, like the future reality is in this place. It's here. And Willard says, like, there's not another universe besides. It's not like we go somewhere else, that God created this place. And why would God create this place only to like destroy and create some other place? It's like God created this place. And Willard is saying it's not like that there's some other secret thing that God has created as being experienced. And one of the ways that I understand this is that like this place matters then. Physicality matters. The physical world matters. And a lot of what some of us inherited really is much more Platonic thinking that descends from Plato than it is from New Testament kinds of thinking. From that, yeah, it's really like the Platonic kind of thinking says that there is this ethereal kind of spirit, and that is good. And we talk about spiritual things, and that's good. And whatever is matter, tangible, like that's bad. And one of the pictures of a future hope, one of the things that it does for us is it says like, oh, no, like it's not just like spiritual that continues on. Like in some sort of way, physicality gets passed on and matter gets passed on. This physical world gets passed on. And so like I actually care about those things. I care about physicality. I care about this. And yeah, all kinds of like probably implications on that. There's probably a few more things that maybe we'll circle back to here in a bit. But one of the things that I found myself underlining that I think like maybe has some level of intersection with this is he writes that the superficial view that dominates our culture holds reality to be limited to what can be discovered by significant observation and explanation. So to like talk about maybe another angle or piece of this that I don't want to miss in saying like physicality matters is that he's also saying that the ability to like explain something, the ability to make sense of something, the ability to just observe something falls a bit short. That it's hard to explain things with more mystery and more abstraction. Actual experiences that we have, like love, or like the desire and search for meaning and purpose. And one author I love, who I had on the podcast a while ago, a couple of years ago now, I think, wrote a book called Searching for Magic Eels. His name's Richard Beck. He's an experimental psychologist out of Abilene Christian University in Texas. And one of the things that he talks about in that book is like recapturing the magic or the mystical part of faith and of life, and that there's something like that has gotten missed there in an over pursuit of rationalism. And so Willard uses this as a way of saying that there's this deeper level of reality that takes a step beyond like what is observable. It takes a step beyond, he would say, like subatomic particles and what we can see. And then he describes it this way. He says that a Trinitarian universe, a universe where the reality from which all other realities derive is a society of persons, that God is personal and involves God's own self and individual lives and intervenes in history in this kind of way. And he begins to move into something, and this is like one of those places where I found myself, I don't know that I would say I was fully bumping up against it, but I felt like he starts bordering on denying some of the significance of physicality. Like I feel like he dances this line, and I don't know what to do with it all, but I feel like he dances this line of denying the significance of physicality and even thinking bodily about the afterlife. But then he would write things where I'd be like, oh, no. Like, I think he's got room for this. And I think that that's a part of his picture. And one of the places where I thought like I saw some room for this with him was that he does write about post-resurrection Jesus. And that post-resurrection Jesus has a body that interacts with physical realities. Now, as an aside, one of the things that this like brought up for me and made me think about is over the last several years, I have developed a lot of friends, and maybe even some of you listening, who believe that the resurrection, talking about Jesus' resurrection, was actually metaphorical and that it's not bodily. And friends, if that's where you're at, know this, that no, like I've got tons of respect for you. I think that there's plenty of room in the church for you, and I have learned a lot from you. I am better having interacted with you around this sort of thinking. Like this has been really, really helpful for me. And still though, for me, and it's just me personally, where I find myself personally, and I don't feel like I need to impose this on everybody else. There's probably a time where I felt like I did, but I don't. But personally for me, the actual physical bodily resurrection of Jesus is still one of the things that's like hard for me to personally give up. And there's a few reasons that it's hard for me to give up, but one of them is what Willard is talking about in this chapter. It's this connection as a picture of the life beyond this one. That resurrection, Jesus' resurrection in particular, like Paul would at one point, I think in Corinthians, would describe it as the first fruits. That it's this picture of like, this is what's to come. He's giving us like, it's the inauguration of the experience of what's to come. And it's also the picture of it, the archetype of it. And so resurrection is giving us a picture of the experience of the afterlife. And to miss it as physical, I think potentially, and those of you who are metaphorical resurrection folks, like send me a note, pushback on this. I'd love to hear your like pushback on this. But physical resurrection to me is one of the things that connects us to like an afterlife that is bodily and physical and that engages in matter and doesn't end up in this sort of like experience that really is just more about some sort of like disembodied, abstract, metaphysical beings that have no kind of physicality. And the way that Willard, though, would talk about Jesus' resurrection body is that it was physical and it interacted with physical realities, but it wasn't restrained by space and time and physical causality in the same manner that we understand physical bodies. And like the best way that I could think about it was that it's like, it's physical, but it's more than our experience of physical. It's bodily, but it's more than our experience of bodily. And maybe that's where there's some room for those of us who are bodily resurrection folks and those of us who are metaphorical resurrection folks to find some sort of intersection. Is that like, gosh, I think that there's this tangible resurrection that happens, but somehow it's more than what I understand as tangible. It's bodily, but somehow it's more than what I understand as bodily. And a part of what then is hard for me to get to is that if there's a life after this life, which I think, to be honest, in this kind of discussion, we have to use language like if. But if there is, and if opens itself up still to all kinds of potential of hope. But if there is, the physicality of that experience makes sense to me. It makes sense to me from like the biblical narrative. I think it even just resonates in a larger sense too of like, what does physicality matter if it's just this sort of like temporary reprieve? Like, what does it matter if it's just this like sort of like blip kind of experience, and to move it into maybe even just a small bit of like a theology, or maybe even a small bit of like even like maybe a little bit of philosophical theology, maybe like something that hints in that direction, is to ask a question of like, why would God act in incarnational ways? And by the way, like God acts in incarnational ways, not just in Jesus. And incarnation, right, is this theological term that we use to talk about the divine and humanity, or the divine and matter coming together. And that one of the things that the church has said for ages is that what happens in the person of Jesus is that Jesus is 100% divine and 100% human, and that there's this intersection of 100% of both. And that incarnational realities is where the divine and matter intersect in that kind of way. And it happens in a pronounced way in Jesus, but it's happening long before that. It's happening in the way that God creates the world. It's happening as God breathes God's own breath and spirit into the dust of the ground. And the biblical story of humanity, that there's some incarnational realities that are happening there. And like, why would God act in incarnational ways if that's like inconsequential in the end, if only like one part of that equation actually matters? And so the picture that the scriptures seem to present of the physicality of the afterlife seems to be significant. Yeah, I mean, here's something else Willard would write. He says, we can be sure that heaven, in the sense of our afterlife, is just our future in this universe. There's not another universe besides this one. I guess I already read that one. But one of the reasons I wrote that again, I'm realizing, is because I also wanted to say it's not just that there's not another universe besides this one. I think I would also venture to say there's not another earth than this one. And so when Revelation speaks of a new heaven and a new earth, it's not wholly other, but it's a renewed and restored earth. It's not new in the sense of it didn't exist before. It's new in the sense of like a car or piece of furniture has been restored. And so all of that long, like little like rambling thing there is this way I think of trying to say that like physicality matters. And so the physicality of a future vision matters. And so then that affects us now, right? That affects the way that we think about this earth, the way that we think about creation. And so we've begun to recognize, like, okay, if this is the place, then we should care about this place. And it matters also because of the way that we think about our bodies, and that our bodies matter. And one of the things that's been, like, I think a helpful move in the church and in the last bit, it's probably been longer than, but in my awareness of it is, the last 10, 20 years really is seeing that like our bodies matter, and paying attention to our bodies matters, and feels like a really helpful move of the church. And it's also like a part of paying attention to what's the future hope and how does that affect how we think about things today. So paying attention to bodies, listening to our bodies. We have seen folks developing more robust theologies about like, what does healing mean? What does things that we would consider physical ailments, like what do we do with that? Things that we would have called maybe deformities at times. And disabilities, and to actually like pay attention to our bodies and to say that our bodies matter, I think starts to develop new kinds of vision and thinking around that. And yeah, one of these times we should get somebody on to help us think through that some more. But all that to say within this, that physicality matters in our future vision, which means that it matters for us here and now. Gosh, one more little tangent here. This is why I have discovered that spiritual disciplines where you are doing something, where you are walking, where you're gardening, where you're woodworking, where you are fly fishing, where you are sewing and crocheting and gardening and baking and cooking, where you are doing this like tangible physical activity, that there's something like incredibly redemptive about that. Instead of just trying to do spiritual disciplines, instead of just like engaging in things that just engage our mind, that allows us to stay detached from our bodies and our physicality, to recognize that the things that we do with our body can engage the whole person and can be a part of like our spiritual formation and forming us into who we were designed and created to be, that's become so meaningful and helpful to me. And I found it to be so meaningful and helpful for so many others. And so this future vision of physicality, that physicality matters, like I think it's got all these like sort of ripples for us in that. Yeah. So one of the things that Willard quotes a few different passages in here, and there's one that I wanted to read because I think like I think it's been a really meaningful passage to me in thinking about future realities and future hope. And I actually think this is one of the areas where I'm like, gosh, maybe he falls short a little bit in how he engages with this. He quotes Isaiah 65:17-25, and I'm just going to read. I'm not sure what translation he's using here. Maybe it's even his own. I'm just going to read what he's got in his book here. Here's what it says. Behold, I create the heavens and the earth all over again. Be glad and rejoice forever in what I create. I create my city, Jerusalem. It is a joy, and her people are gladness. Which, by the way, like what a beautiful picture of like the future. If a future hope isn't joy and gladness, like I think we're actually missing something. No longer will be heard in her the sound of weeping and the voice of weeping and the sound of crying. No longer babies dying or mature people who do not live to the end of a full life. And so there's this description of experience that is both sort of like some sort of like emotional wholeness and some sort of like physical wholeness that's being described here. And then this is the thing that I kind of wanted to just sit on just for a moment. When they build houses, they will get to live in them. When they plant vineyards, they, not others, will be the one who eat the fruit. They shall not labor in vain or bear children to be destroyed. Before they call on me, I will answer. Animals even will stop killing one another, and in my new world, every kind of evil will be eliminated. This picture of building houses, not for someone else to live in, but for you to live in. This picture of planting vineyards, not for others to get to reap the benefits of your labor, but that you get to reap the benefits of your labor, that you get to eat the fruit, that you get to have that. It's this picture of it's this picture of justice. And in some ways, it's some pictures of economic justice. And as Willard talks about this here, he talks about he gives just kind of a brief general statement about like the public order being accomplished in ways that the government can't. And I can appreciate that. But like, there's this picture of I think takes it a step further than just kind of saying that just kind of saying like someday God's going to do things and the government can't do these things for you. That it's like there is a picture of a future hope where there's economic justice, where there is no longer exploitation of workers who are being used just for someone else's benefit, just to get someone else rich, just for someone else to receive the fruit of your labor, that you work and you get to bask in the glory and the experience of having worked and receiving the benefit of your work, and that there's something like redemptive and beautiful about that. And this matters, I think, for the exact reason that Willard says our picture of what's next matters, because it affects who we're becoming and how we're acting today. And if this is this future picture of like what we're moving towards, in the same way that we would say that physicality matters, well, then in the same way that wouldn't we say that this sort of like move towards justice matters, and this move towards even economic justice matters, and this move towards being able to experience, for people to be able to experience the glory and the redemptive fruit of their own labor, that actually matters, and that there's something redemptive and whole about that. And so he then writes, I don't remember if it was before it or after it, but I just had this quote written down. He writes that the greatest temptation to evil that humanity ever suffers is the temptation to make a Jerusalem happen by human means. God's way of moving towards the future is, with gentle persistence and unfailing purpose, to bring about the transformation of the human heart by speaking with human beings and living with and in them. This comes back to his picture of like, we're in a Trinitarian universe, and Trinitarian it's personal and interacts with persons. And so he says, like, you try to make a Jerusalem happen, this picture of like, here is this future reality that we're moving towards, and you try to force that to happen through your own means, but God's means is by God transforming the human heart by personal interaction and engagement with him. And this is one of those places where I found myself both like saying yes and no. Like I found myself at the same time with moving in both directions here. I mean, I definitely for a while I took the vantage point that like the most significant thing that we can do is to see individuals changed and transformed, opened up to the power of God in their life to change and transform them. And that as we do that, I thought, we will see systems and structures transform, because systems and structures are made up of individuals. The problem with just that is that project doesn't seem to have worked. And it also negates those whose realities are being hurt by systems and structures. And it just kind of lets those who are currently being hurt or oppressed, or even like whose lives are in danger by systems and structures, it can negate that. And I wonder if even like in the way that Justin Morgan challenged us to think about the way that Willard talks about spiritual formation as maybe like falling into the same trap that he warns about in the Gospel of Sin Management. I wonder if that even happens here a bit, where like what used to happen actually in more conservative circles that I was in was that the main point of the project was personal transformation. And if we just change individual hearts, then, X, Y, and Z all happens. And then what I had experienced in more progressive circles is like, we'll just focus on changing systems and structures, focus on government reform, on voting the right people into office, enacting the right policies, and then in other systems and structures. And actually, one of the things that I've experienced over the last 15, 20 years is that shifted from a purely progressive vantage point to having become the strategy of the extreme right as well, especially as we look at the rise of Christian nationalism, that it's like, who cares who the people are? Who cares what's happening to them? Who cares about that like actual transformation, as long as they're enacting the right policies, as long as they are changing the systems and structures in the way that I think are the right things. And it doesn't matter who you're becoming, as long as you enact these larger sweeping changes. And this is how we like find justification for elevating terrible people into leadership positions that have all kinds of like other implications. It's because personal transformation isn't significant. But one of the things that seems to me is that a vision of the kingdom means we're partnering with God in the work that God is doing in the world, which means that we have a vision of the kingdom. And Dallas talks about this early on in like the first 3 chapters in a lot of ways. This picture of new heavens and new earth we find in places like Isaiah 65, that we just read, Revelation 21, we get this picture of it. And there's this personal transformation that matters because who you're becoming matters. If we're created to co-rule with God, then the project of becoming the kind of person who God can set free, as Willard would write in this chapter, well, then that matters because who you're becoming will overflow then into what you're doing. But without a vision towards larger societal transformation that somehow intersects and interacts with that, we become a community that's segmented off from the rest of the world. And we create our own little enclave while we wait for someday to hopefully experience the picture of the new heavens and new earth that will just sort of magically happen. And man, it's a bummer for everyone else who isn't a part of our little separate community if we segment ourselves off that way. And I do find myself agreeing with Willard that to try to force that to happen is not helpful either, because it's pushing against the way of the kingdom. To try to force it to happen is missing that the way of the kingdom is a way of service, and it's a way of sacrifice, and it's not a way of power over, and it's not a way of manipulation and coercion. But if we are not working towards our own transformation and also the liberation and the freedom of others, we're missing it. And so it's we are both working towards the liberation and freedom of others, which includes engaging in systems and structures that are oppressive and hurtful for that. But the way in which those things are achieved matters. And so the way that I found myself saying yes with Willard here is we don't force Jerusalem to happen. We don't force this picture of justice to happen. We don't force this picture of things being made whole and restored and right to happen, because it's doing it through force. It's doing it through getting power over others. It's creating systems of manipulation and coercion, and it's not the way of the kingdom. And so it is both about this larger systemic transformation, but it is also about who are we becoming as we engage in that work, which is maybe why there's probably a lot of reasons why several of us who probably find ourselves in this kind of a place resonate with the work of Father Richard Rohr, Father Gregory Boyle, some folks like them. But Richard Rohr would create his organization as a center for action and contemplation, that it's one doesn't exist without the other. There's this intersection of the two. And to move into just the contemplative space where we are being personally transformed is to miss something deeper and richer, and it's it's a shallow experience. And to just move into the activism side, where it's just about moving towards justice and restoration, and that there isn't any kind of personal transformation, seems to be missing something. So, friends, anyways, I don't know if I made any kind of coherent sense here because I wasn't with somebody else to help that to happen, but those are just some scattered thoughts that kind of began arising from this chapter. But I wanted to close out our time with a few more random thoughts, but these are just observations from we've been doing this. This is our 12th episode in this, and we've been doing this for several months. And one of the ways that I have learned that I operate is that I tend to intuit a thing. I have this intuitive sense that oh, this is what I should do. And then I'll do it. And then I reflect back on it to make sense of it. And there's plenty of things that are bad about that. And there's plenty of some of you can make sense of things on the front end. And I've got so much appreciation for you. And we have to partner up on things because I'll do a lot of things that don't work or make sense, but I need to do them in order to make make sense of it and reflect back on it. Anyways, I don't know on the front end of all of the reasons why I felt it was important to re-engage this book. I had some things that I said in that very first episode about here's why I want to do this, but I don't fully know and understand why. But as I was trying to make sense of spending these last few months on this, here's a few things that I feel I was paying attention to. One is I feel I keep leaning into a greater understanding and realization that the way of growth and the way of development looks like transcending and including, which means that there are places that I have been, there are things that have formed me there are parts of my experience that have been really important, but they are not they are not the end. And so I move beyond them. But in moving beyond them, I don't need to dismiss them. I don't need to get rid of them, and I don't need to pretend like I don't even need to look down on them. I need to figure out like how do I include them into the space where I am now, because they were important and they were needed. Sometimes what happens is, we move beyond it and we kind of dismiss where we were, and we kind of can even like look down on where we were before. And actually, I don't think that that's growth. I think that like in some ways, maybe even sometimes you're regressing. You're holding to some maybe different beliefs than you did before, but you're not actually like growing and expanding. Sometimes what we do though is that like something really moves us. It has a transformative power in our lives, and we stay stuck there. And we begin defining ourselves around that experience, around that learning, around that time in life. Sometimes we find folks who are always trying to get back to it, and they're always trying to go back to that place. I don't remember if I was reading this or somebody's telling me about this, but like this picture that would be talked about of the Garden of Eden, and that folks getting kicked out of the garden, and that you've got angel guarding the garden, and that some folks are just like trying to get back in. Some folks are like standing at the gate and they're like, I've got to force my way back in here. I think it comes from a French philosopher now that I'm starting to remember this. And so some folks are like, I had this experience of Eden and I've got to get back in there. And they're just like sitting at the gate that's being guarded by an angel with a flaming sword. Then some folks are like, I'm out of Eden. Like I can't go back in there. Like forget the whole thing. And they kind of abandon the project. Some folks go on a journey, and they go on this like long journey as they leave Eden. And eventually where they find themselves is they find themselves walking back into Eden, and they go back in, but they go in through this like back gate that you didn't know was there. And so they find themselves having that experience, but having traversed this long journey in order to get back there. And I think that's a bit of a picture of what it looks like to transcend and include, that it's like there's some meaningful experiences that we had. There's some things that have been helpful for us, and we go on this long journey and we find our way back to those things, and we figure out like, how do we reintegrate those in? And so like that to me is a bit of my experience with Willard this time around with this book, was that like I have this appreciation for so much. I would still say that this book, it was this defining significant point in my life, what it did for me, and it opened doors for me that I wouldn't be where I am today without it. And so it wasn't just a catalyst for me, and that was really important, but I think that there's been something for me really important about kind of going back and revisiting and figuring out like, what does it look like to include some of this in where I am today and to re-engage in that. So that's one of the things I've been reflecting a bit on. This is just like super like pragmatic, I think, but like just the way that a book can open up new doors for you. I'm shocked by the number of people who can point to this book as a turning point for them. That like I used to think, I would say all the time to folks at this point that this book was a significant book in my life. And I would often say most significant book outside of the Bible was the thing that I would always say when I was pastoring. And the number of people who I found who would say something very similar about this book, The Divine Conspiracy, is really fascinating to me. And to like engage a book, to engage reading in general, you have to have an openness to think differently. You have to have a sense that you're missing something. And so it got me thinking about like, even as we grow and change, like who are the voices that are challenging where we're at now? And like when new spaces are opened up to us, we can get into we can fall into a bit of a rut, or a bit of like you think of like a groove on a record player, and we get into a new groove and we just kind of stay in that groove. And then what we are reading, paying attention to, listening is all in that same groove. But the reason that we first got into that new groove is because something pushed us from an old groove into there. There's something that opened us up to grow and change and see things differently. So like, I don't know that I have a lot on that, other than like, I'm trying to be paying attention to, and even one of the things that this opened me up to was to be really mindful about what am I reading that's pushing me in maybe some new and different directions, that's challenging like the groove that I find myself in. Yeah, and even like I think that this was one of the fascinating things to me just from doing this podcast was I think 3 of my interviews all trace back to Rob Bell as the first one who gave someone this book and got them to read it. And there's something really fascinating about that, about like kind of being an evangelist for this thing that it's like this shape me and move me in a way, and where you have this kind of influence where you pass that on to others. And I'm still kind of reflecting on Jason Miller and I on the episode we did here, reflected briefly on like, gosh, who's writing that book now? Like, where is that now? I don't know what that is, but I think there is something really significant for those of you who have influence with others, the things that have shaped and influenced you, and being mindful about like, what am I passing on that is helping people that are in a certain groove in the record player now to like see outside of that groove, to be able to move into a new one. Like there's something really sacred that we have responsibility with there to be mindful of. Yeah. Another thing that kind of like stirred up in me a little bit is that when people are challenging a system, because I think what Willard is doing here is he's challenging a system within the church. They're doing it from a specific vantage point and context. And it's actually really helpful. It was really helpful for me in going through it this time to be mindful that Willard isn't doing everything here. When people are challenging a system and they're doing it from a specific vantage point and context, they aren't doing everything. And so to put it in its context and to ask like to ask the question of like, what system are they trying to push forward into new spaces? And then to hear them and to see them through that lens, rather than to put the onus on them that they need to be doing everything with whatever the work is, and to find fault with them for not doing everything. They're not developing some new systematic theology or new systematic way of thinking that is this once and for all, like we finally found it. Everybody is putting out a work in some sort of way that's coming from a specific vantage point and context. And they are often challenging some sort of system within it. And so to appreciate it through that lens, I think has been really, really helpful for me. And I found that to be just in this re-engagement of this book this time around. I found that to be really helpful, maybe in ways that it hadn't been before. And then the last thing is a little bit maybe more personal, is that like I realized, gosh, I miss processing stuff like this in community. I was with a friend recently, and we were having this conversation that I know a lot of us are kind of over talking about ways that the pandemic has shaped us and changed us. But I find myself still processing it quite a bit, thinking about it in larger cultural ways, and still continue thinking about it for me personally. And as I was talking with this friend, we were talking about how we still have this desire for the kind of community that we had pre-pandemic. But one of the things that we noticed is that we don't seem to have the same energy or the same capacity for it as we did pre-pandemic. I'm swirling around what that means and what all to do with that. And I don't know if that's true for you or not, but it's true for me. And like even like some of what's changed for me is that some of my closest friendships don't exist locally anymore. And some of that was pandemic and some of that was other factors. But yeah, I found that shift. And I found like where I find myself at home in a faith community isn't local anymore. And so things like this book that I would have at times read with others and processed with others in some sort of way, I find that happens far, far less for me. And this gave me the small taste of re-engaging that, of like with a friend who I find to be thoughtful and interesting, to like read a chapter and then to just see where that takes us. Gave me the small taste of like, gosh, I miss that. And I'm not necessarily looking for answers or fixes to that right now. Like I'm just like reflecting on my experience. And what I've noticed is that some people have reverted back to the way that they engaged in life and community pre-pandemic. And for some people, that seems to be working for them. For some people, I think that it's a negation of that, like something in them was shifting, and that I think that there's potentially, for some of us, sometimes we get some fear around that and we have a hard time sitting in tension. And so we revert back to what was normal and familiar. So I think for some folks, it seems like that's been a healthy revert back. And for some folks, like I just have some questions around that. Some people just kind of shut down and are still trying to figure out how or when or if to like re-engage more. And I think some of us are still like reimagining and experimenting with what it looks like to re-engage in a kind of community that is shaping and challenging and helping to form us. And in some ways, I think that's maybe some of what's happened with podcasts right now. Like podcasts have gone through different seasons of popularity, and it seems that we're in one of those right now where like everybody I know has a podcast, right? And as best as I can tell, I think, and tell me again, like, if you got some pushback on this, I'd love to hear it. But people seem to listen to podcasts for content, but like more than that, also for connection. Because we keep listening to some of the same ones, and we start to feel a sort of affinity or connection with the hosts, and we start to feel like we know them a bit. But it's still largely one-sided, and so it's still largely imbalanced, and so it's not community, but there's some sort of like connection that's there. And I'm still trying to figure out what some sort of like co-learning looks like for me in this season. And it's actually one of the reasons that I found myself leading cohorts a good bit, is because there's something about gathering a small group of people who are all committed to like learning and growing and thoughtfully engaging one another and doing it in this kind of intentional way where like when you actually like pay for a thing and you like as a part of it like go away together and then you've got these like connection points. There's something about that like I found that to be for me in this season that maybe most helpful, one of the most helpful models of kind of experiencing that. But all that to say that re-engaging in this and having a partner where it was like I wasn't just interviewing them on their book or whatever like they're working on, but like we had both engaged in the same content and then we come together for a conversation around that content that like this stirred in me like just personally like, oh gosh, I'm missing that. How do I find that? How do I recreate that? What does that look like in this season? What do I want that to be? What do I need that even to be? And how do I reimagine that in just the reality of what life looks like for so many of us right now? So yeah, thank you for letting me be a little bit self-indulgent there. I hope that like that's helpful for some of you. Is one of the things that I have learned from Father Richard, who we mentioned earlier, is that one of the things that Franciscan spirituality teaches is that the universal is found in the particular. And so sometimes in sharing the particular experience, sometimes it has like larger resonance. And so maybe that little bit of self-indulgence has a little bit of larger resonance with you, maybe not. And if not, I apologize for wasting your time. But friends, like I don't take for granted, and I don't take it lightly, that you would hang out here for, an hour on some sort of semi-regular basis to, get to hear us like process things and to get to be a part of that in some kind of small way. And so like, what a gift to have you here with us. Like, thank you for that. Thank you for the, like just showing up and engaging in that way. I'm so grateful for that. And maybe just a couple of practical things as we kind of close out here. First is that there's some of you that like contribute like faithfully to the work that I do and donate financially. And gosh, I'm so grateful for you. And, if any of you feel like you would want to be helpful in that, like I put things in the show notes every time that's got some information about how you can give tax deductible gifts. And if you want to help contribute to not only like being able to like continue to do this kind of stuff to put out work like these podcasts, but also in the work that I get to do with pastors and leaders in new and emerging spaces and post-evangelical churches. And I find myself doing a lot of coaching of pastors. I find myself doing a lot of work with staff teams. I find myself doing a lot of pastoral care there. And a lot of those churches either can't afford to pay much or much of anything. And so because of some generous donors, I'm able to do on a limited basis some of that for at like really reduced rates. And so thank you for your contributions there. And yeah, if you would want to be helpful to help me be able to do that for more folks, I would love to be able to give more of my time to that space. I'd love to be able to give more of my time to the kinds of people that you hear on this podcast, to be able to pastor them, to be able to help them in the work that they are doing, to think strategically about it, to help them do the good works that they are doing, and to help make sure that somebody's caring for them, then yeah, I would greatly appreciate it. So practical there. Practical around this podcast in particular is I'm going to take some time off. This was a lot of 12 weeks. 12 episodes of this, but we'll be back probably late in the summer because I got some friends putting out some like really good work that I want to make sure that you are aware of heading into the fall. And so I'll be working on lining up some of those. But until then, friends, thanks for engaging in this. Thanks for being a part of this. And thanks for your time here. And so until next time, grace and peace to you, my friends.